In the previous episode, we explored the beginning of the Siege of Antioch and how the first months of the campaign descended into hunger, disease, hardship, and desperate fighting. In this episode, we follow the Crusaders through one of the most decisive phases of the siege. We examine the departure of the Byzantine commander Taticius, the arrival of Ridwan of Aleppo's relief army, and Bohemond's bold victory at the Battle of Lake Antioch, also known as the Battle of the Iron Bridge. We also explore the unexpected diplomatic mission from the Fatimid Caliphate, the arrival of the English fleet carrying much-needed supplies and siege equipment, and the fierce fighting along the Orontes River that further weakened Antioch's defenders. These events transformed the course of the siege and brought the Crusaders one step closer to capturing Antioch. Welcome to the second stage of the Siege of Antioch. Throughout January of AD 1098, the Crusaders experienced only a brief and limited sign of hope. During one of the frequent skirmishes outside Antioch, they captured a young Muslim nobleman of high status. After discovering that his family controlled one of the city's towers, the Crusaders attempted to negotiate with them, offering his release in exchange for secret access to the tower. Communication was established, and the plan appeared promising. However, Yaghi-Siyan uncovered the conspiracy before it could be carried out and removed the family from their position of authority. The Crusaders responded harshly. Their captive, who had already endured severe torture, was brought before the city walls and publicly executed by beheading in full view of Antioch's defenders. Although the attempt to gain entry into the city failed, the episode revealed an important vulnerability in Antioch's defenses: the possibility that betrayal from within could succeed where direct assault had not. In late January or early February 1098, another important figure left the Crusader army. Unlike earlier deserters such as Peter the Hermit and William the Carpenter, Taticius, Emperor Alexios I Komnenos' Byzantine representative, departed openly. He claimed that he was returning to Asia Minor to gather supplies and reinforcements, and the Crusaders initially accepted his explanation. To demonstrate his intention of returning, he reportedly left his personal belongings behind before departing with his men. Although Taticius later rejoined Emperor Alexios, he never returned to Antioch. His absence was widely viewed by the Crusaders as a betrayal, and many contemporary Latin chroniclers condemned his actions. Raymond of Toulouse's chaplain, for example, accused him of abandoning the army under false pretenses and bringing lasting disgrace upon himself and his followers. Although the Crusaders distrusted Taticius, he was equally suspicious of them, and not without reason. According to his later account at the Byzantine court, Bohemond privately warned him that some Crusader leaders believed Emperor Alexios I Komnenos was secretly negotiating with the Seljuks to destroy the Crusader army. Bohemond claimed that these leaders were planning to kill Taticius and advised him to leave the camp for his own safety. Believing the threat to be genuine, Taticius decided to depart. In return for Bohemond's warning, he reportedly promised him control of the disputed territory in Cilicia, which had previously been contested by Tancred and Baldwin. Meanwhile, the Muslim forces began organizing another attempt to relieve Antioch. After Dukat failed to provide the promised support, Yaghi-Siyan once again sought assistance from his former overlord, Ridwan of Aleppo. Recognizing that his earlier inaction had allowed the Crusaders to reach Antioch, Ridwan agreed to intervene after Yaghi-Siyan renewed his allegiance. He assembled an army with the support of his cousin, Sokman of the Artukids, and his father-in-law, the Emir of Hama. By early February 1098, these allied forces had reoccupied Harim and gathered there before launching an attack on the Crusader camp. The unexpected clash with Dukat of Damascus in December 1097 likely convinced the Crusaders of the need for better intelligence. By the time Ridwan of Aleppo prepared his relief expedition, they had improved their scouting and local information network, giving them some warning of his approach. Even so, they still faced the serious danger of being trapped between Ridwan's advancing army and Antioch's garrison. As they prepared for another battle, the Crusaders faced several critical problems, the most pressing of which was the severe shortage of horses. This had already been a concern during the march across Asia Minor, but the hardships of the winter siege made the situation far worse. Contemporary accounts frequently emphasize the desperate lack of fodder, noting that straw was scarce, and grain had become so expensive that even a large sum of money could barely provide enough feed for a single horse for one night. When news reached the Crusaders that Ridwan's army was approaching, Bohemond believed they had to seize the initiative. He rejected a defensive stand at the Iron Bridge, recognizing that it would likely become a prolonged engagement while leaving the Crusader camp vulnerable to attacks from Antioch. With their forces divided and caught between the city's garrison and Ridwan's advancing army, the Crusaders stood little chance of success. The Crusaders faced an extremely difficult strategic situation, providing Bohemond with an opportunity to demonstrate his military leadership. At a council of the princes, he argued that their limited numbers made it impossible to defend against both Antioch's garrison and Ridwan's approaching army at the same time. Instead, he proposed dividing the army into two forces. His plan called for the infantry to remain in camp to defend it and contain any attacks from Antioch's garrison, while the mounted knights would accompany him to intercept Ridwan's approaching army near Harem beyond the Iron Bridge. The other Crusader leaders accepted the proposal and agreed that Bohemond would command the expedition. One contemporary chronicler, writing in a highly flattering tone, claimed that Bohemond's followers praised him as a wise and capable commander and urged him to take charge of the operation. However, the Crusaders faced severe shortages of both men and horses. Bohemond was able to assemble only about 700 knights, many of whom rode pack horses or mules instead of war horses. To preserve the element of surprise and avoid alerting Antioch's defenders, Bohemond decided that the Crusader force would depart under the cover of darkness. As he had done at Dorylaeum, Bohemond sought to prevent the Turks from using their preferred tactic of surrounding the Crusader army. He also aimed to achieve surprise. Rather than attempting to block the Turkish advance at the Iron Bridge, where they were likely expecting resistance, he chose to attack after they had crossed the river, when they would probably anticipate an unobstructed march toward Antioch. Recognizing that his force was too small for a prolonged engagement, Bohemond also sought to exaggerate its apparent strength. According to one eyewitness, the Crusader army appeared several times larger than it actually was. To achieve this, he reorganized his roughly 700 knights into multiple cavalry formations before the attack. Bohemond's plan carried considerable risk. He did not know the exact size of Ridwan's army, only that his own force was heavily outnumbered. Contemporary Latin chroniclers estimated the Turkish army at between 12,000 and 30,000 men. Although the lower estimate is generally considered more plausible, it still meant that the Crusaders' remaining knights faced odds of more than 10 to 1. Despite these daunting circumstances, the Crusaders maintained their morale. According to one chronicler, they spent the night singing songs, perhaps recalling the legendary deeds of Roland, and approached the coming battle with remarkable confidence. In contrast to the earlier foraging battle, the Crusaders now sought to gain the advantage through surprise. On the night of 8 February of AD 1098, they left Antioch under the cover of darkness and marched quickly toward the Iron Bridge. Bohemond also appears to have concealed the true purpose of the expedition from many of his own soldiers, likely allowing them to believe they were setting out on a foraging mission rather than marching to confront Ridwan's relief army. About 6 or 7 miles from the city, they halted behind a low hill overlooking an open plain near the Orontes River and a nearby lake. By choosing the battlefield in advance, the Crusaders effectively prepared a large-scale ambush. Although the exact location cannot be identified with certainty, they appear to have selected ground that would restrict the Turks' ability to carry out their preferred tactic of encirclement. Natural obstacles, including the river, nearby lake, and surrounding hills, likely helped limit the enemy's freedom of movement while providing some concealment for the Crusader cavalry before the attack. On the morning of 9 February AD 1098, Crusader scouts reported that Ridwan's army was advancing from the Iron Bridge, with 2 forward detachments leading the main force. Realizing they could not win a prolonged engagement, The Crusaders had to rely on speed, surprise, and the shock of a cavalry charge. Success depended on careful timing. As Ridwan's forces approached, Bohemond committed 5 of the 6 cavalry squadrons against the enemy vanguard, while keeping the 6th in reserve. According to one eyewitness, the battle opened with intense fighting as volleys of missiles filled the sky. Although heavily outnumbered, the Crusader cavalry successfully drew Ridwan's main force into the engagement. As the Muslim army advanced and gradually pushed the Crusaders back, it appeared that victory was within Ridwan's grasp. Despite Bohemond's careful planning, the Crusaders gradually lost ground during the early stages of the battle as Ridwan's numerically superior army pressed them back. One contemporary chronicler claimed that Bohemond, seeing his lines begin to falter while his final squadron remained in reserve, was overcome with emotion. He is said to have urged his constable to lead the reserve forward, encouraging his men to fight not only for victory but also in defense of God and the Holy Sepulchre. This was the decisive moment Bohemond had anticipated. With the Muslim army fully engaged and concentrated in the fighting, he committed the reserve, the 6th Cavalry Squadron, in a powerful charge, striking the enemy at a critical point in the battle. Bohemond personally led the reserve cavalry into the attack, advancing rapidly at the head of the final squadron. Within moments, his distinctive blood-red banner could be seen above the Muslim ranks. The sudden arrival of these fresh troops appears to have had a significant psychological impact. Whether it was the unexpected reserve charge, Bohemond's commanding presence, or a combination of both, the Muslim line began to collapse, and what had been an organized withdrawal quickly turned into a disorderly retreat. A vivid account of the decisive charge is provided by the author of the Gesta Francorum, who was likely present with Bohemond's contingent. He describes Bohemond leading the assault with great determination, his banner visible above the Turkish ranks as the Crusaders renewed their attack. Inspired by his advance, the retreating Crusaders rallied and launched a coordinated assault that caught the Muslim forces by surprise, forcing them into a rapid retreat. The Crusaders then pursued the fleeing army as far as the Iron Bridge, inflicting heavy casualties. Bohemond's carefully timed cavalry charge proved decisive. By committing his reserve at the critical moment, he shattered Ridwan's battle line and transformed what had appeared to be a losing engagement into a decisive victory. The Crusaders pursued the retreating army to Haram, capturing horses and valuable supplies. Soon afterward, the remaining Muslim forces abandoned and burned the castle before retreating eastward, bringing Ridwan's relief expedition to an end. While the Crusader cavalry secured a decisive victory against Ridwan's relief force, the infantry left behind at the camp faced a much more difficult struggle. Yaghi-Siyan launched a full-scale sortie from Antioch, and the camp's defenders gradually began to lose ground. However, later that afternoon, the returning Crusader cavalry came into view. Realizing that Ridwan's army had been defeated, Yaghi-Siyan abandoned the attack and ordered his troops to withdraw behind the city's walls. Around 9 February, AD 1098, the Crusaders received an embassy from the Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt, ruled by the Vizier al-Afdal. The mission was likely connected to earlier contacts established after the capture of Nicaea, possibly with Byzantine encouragement. Deep hostility between the Shia Fatimids and the Sunni Seljuks meant that Egypt had little interest in assisting the Turkish defenders of Antioch. Like many contemporaries, the Fatimids may also have believed that the Crusaders were participating in a limited Byzantine campaign, rather than seeking to conquer Jerusalem. The encounter revealed that both sides had misjudged one another. The Crusaders viewed the Muslim delegation with suspicion, while the Egyptians found a starving and exhausted army that bore little resemblance to the well-organized Byzantine force they had expected. Nevertheless, negotiations continued, and some members of the embassy even witnessed the Crusader victory over Ridwan's relief army, an outcome that likely strengthened the Crusaders' position. The exact details of these negotiations remain unclear because contemporary accounts differ. Most sources agree, however, that the Fatimids proposed some form of agreement. In return for continued Crusader pressure against the Seljuks, They appear to have offered the Crusaders safe access to Jerusalem and possibly limited rights within the city. Some Latin chroniclers even believed that Al-Afdal had expressed an interest in Christianity, though this interpretation is uncertain. The Crusaders rejected these proposals, insisting that Jerusalem belonged to them by God's will, and the embassy departed without reaching an agreement. Although the defeat of Ridwan's relief army greatly boosted Crusader morale, it did little to improve their difficult situation. Food remained scarce, even though supplies increasingly reached the nearby port of St. Simeon, many of them arriving from Cyprus through the efforts of Patriarch Simeon and possibly Taticius. Transporting these supplies to the Crusader camp, however, remained dangerous because raiding parties from Antioch frequently attacked convoys. At the same time, the city's defenders continued to receive provisions through the unblocked Gate of St. George and the fortified bridge. To secure the route to St. Simeon and disrupt Antioch's supply line, Raymond of Toulouse proposed constructing a fortification on the northern bank of the Orontes near the bridge. The project, however, was delayed by a shortage of building materials and skilled masons. The Crusaders' fortunes began to improve in early March, 1098. On 4th March, a fleet carrying English pilgrims arrived at St. Simeon under the command of Edgar Atheling, the exiled Anglo-Saxon claimant to the English throne. After stopping at Constantinople, the fleet brought much-needed siege equipment and skilled craftsmen provided by Emperor Alexios I Komnenos. Although this assistance proved invaluable, many Crusaders chose to overlook the Byzantine emperor's role in providing it. After learning of the fleet's arrival at St. Simeon, Raymond of Toulouse and Bohemond traveled there together, each unwilling to leave the other unsupervised. Their objectives were to recruit as many fighting men as possible from the newly arrived pilgrims and to escort the siege equipment, craftsmen, and supplies back to the Crusader camp. The journey took several days. During their absence, Antioch's garrison launched a series of small attacks against the Crusader camp. These raids appear to have been intended mainly as a diversion, while Yaghi-Siyan secretly positioned troops outside the city to ambush the returning escort. The plan was designed to strike before the Crusaders could strengthen their siege works with the newly arrived materials. On the 7th March, 1098, as Bohemond and Raymond returned from St. Simeon with supplies and the English sailors and craftsmen, the hidden Muslim force launched its attack. Having left the city undetected, the defenders achieved complete surprise. The assault was devastating, and contemporary accounts describe heavy Crusader losses, with many pilgrims killed and hundreds reportedly beheaded. One Latin chronicler regarded these casualties as martyrs who had died for the faith. According to some sources, Bohemond withdrew from the fighting in confusion, while others claim that he had taken a different route and was unaware of the ambush until it had already begun. Amid the fierce fighting, a number of Crusaders managed to break through the Muslim lines and return to the main camp. They informed the remaining leaders, including the now recovered Godfrey of Bouillon, that the escort force was in danger of being overwhelmed and that the newly arrived siege equipment and supplies were at risk of being lost. The news spread rapidly throughout the camp, prompting an immediate response. Inspired by their commitment to the crusade and the goal of reaching the Holy Sepulchre, the Crusaders armed themselves, crossed the bridge of boats, and marched out together to rescue their comrades and avenge those who had fallen. After crossing the bridge, the arriving reinforcements found Godfrey of Bouillon organizing the Crusader forces. Messengers from Bohemond soon arrived with reports on the size and movements of the Muslim force, and Bohemond himself rejoined the army with the knights who had escaped the initial ambush. The Crusaders quickly regrouped and prepared to counterattack. Before they could advance, however, another contingent of cavalry suddenly emerged from Antioch through the bridge gate and struck the Crusaders from the rear. Yaghi-Siyan appears to have intended to trap the Crusader army between two attacking forces while supporting the assault with archers positioned on the city's walls. After the cavalry had ridden out, the city gates were closed, committing the attackers to the battle. Contemporary chroniclers describe the ensuing fighting as exceptionally fierce, with volleys of arrows darkening the sky and the battlefield resembling the apocalyptic scenes celebrated in medieval epic. With Muslim forces attacking from two directions and the Crusaders either retreating in panic or charging forward in fierce resistance, the battle soon descended into a chaotic melee. Although the fighting became disorganized, this type of close-quarters combat ultimately favored the Crusaders. During the engagement, Godfrey of Bouillon won particular praise for his courage and skill in battle. Contemporary chroniclers credited him with killing several Muslim warriors and recounted a famous, though likely exaggerated episode in which he supposedly split a mounted opponent in two with a single sword stroke. According to the story, the rider's horse continued galloping toward the city, with the lower half of its rider still in the saddle. Whether historical or legendary, the account illustrates the heroic reputation that Godfrey acquired among the Crusaders and in later medieval tradition. As the battle continued, the other Crusader leaders, especially Robert of Normandy and Raymond of Toulouse, launched a coordinated attack against the Muslim troops that had emerged through the bridge gate. The Crusaders pushed the attackers back toward the river and the walls of Antioch, compressing them into a narrow space where movement became almost impossible. Contemporary accounts describe the violence of the fighting in dramatic terms, claiming that the bridge and the Orontes River were filled with the bodies of the fallen. The battle continued until nightfall, when the remaining Muslim forces managed to clear a path near the bridge gate and retreat safely inside the city. The Crusaders then gathered the spoils of war and gave thanks through prayer, believing that their victory demonstrated divine favor. According to Latin chroniclers, the defeat greatly weakened Antioch's defenders, who were no longer able to challenge the Crusaders with the same confidence as before. The day after the battle, a small group of Antioch's defenders left the city to bury their dead. The Crusaders allowed them to do so peacefully, suggesting that despite months of conflict, some limited restraint still existed between the two sides. However, this brief moment of tolerance soon ended. After learning that the dead had been buried, some Crusaders entered the burial area, destroyed the graves, and removed the bodies. They collected the severed heads of the fallen as proof of their victory, with estimates of the number taken ranging from 1,500 to 7,000, not including those lost in the Orontes River. The heads were later sent to Saint Simeon, reportedly as a display of triumph to the Egyptian envoys. The incident was controversial even among medieval writers. Some claimed the act was intended to frighten the defenders of Antioch, while others believed it was motivated by greed or the desire for trophies. Later chroniclers criticized the destruction of the graves, viewing it as a shameful act. Nevertheless, in the immediate aftermath of the battle, many Crusaders saw it as a symbol of their victory and a way to demonstrate the scale of their defeat of the enemy. Months of hardship, starvation, disease, desertion, and constant fighting had transformed the Crusader army. Those unable to endure the siege had either died, deserted, or fallen in battle, leaving behind a smaller but more experienced and resilient force. Of the roughly 100,000 Crusaders who had departed Europe, no more than about 30,000 are thought to have remained. Despite their recent victories, however, the Siege of Antioch was still far from over. With these events, the siege entered its final phase. In the next chapter, we will examine the discovery of the Holy Lance, the arrival of the last major Muslim relief army, and the dramatic Battle of Antioch, in which the Crusaders, having been transformed from besiegers into the besieged, fought for their survival against overwhelming odds.